Come, let's rest here a while. Tonight, the lake is very still. Even the mountains seem sleepy. The moon has wandered high above the water, and somewhere across the shore, a little cabin keeps its lantern glowing for anyone who may still be awake. And beside the lake sits a little bear, wrapped in his old scarf, holding a warm cup of tea, fishing very seriously, with remarkably little interest in catching anything, which, to his surprise, was turning out to be one of the nicest evenings he'd had in quite some time. Truthfully, Bear had long ago stopped worrying about whether he caught a fish. He simply liked the feeling of sitting beside the water. The tiny sounds, the cool air, the gentle wading. Bear believed wading was an underrated activity. Most creatures, he thought, were always hurrying toward something. But lakes did not hurry, nor moons, nor old pine trees, and they all seemed perfectly content about it. Bear took a small sip from his tea. Still warm. That was nice too. He reached into the little canvas bag beside him. Inside was a small tin. Inside the tin were 3 oat biscuits. Bear looked at them thoughtfully. One was for later. One was for even later. And one, after a great deal of careful consideration, had been chosen for the fish. He fastened the biscuit carefully onto the pole. It was not, perhaps, the sort of bait experienced fishermen would recommend. Bear considered this. I expect fish might like biscuits. He looked out across the moonlit water. I've never actually asked. Maybe cake next time. The lake offered no opinion, which Bear took as quiet encouragement. He cast the line with great concentration. The biscuit landed upon the water with a cheerful little plop. Bear watched the ripples spread. I had imagined that looking slightly more graceful, he said to himself. The lake, as always, was kind enough not to mention it. He settled back against the moss, pleased enough with the attempt. Fishing, Bear had discovered long ago, was mostly sitting beside a lake while occasionally giving the fish something interesting to think about. That seemed perfectly worthwhile. A tiny breeze wandered through the reeds. Somewhere nearby, a frog cleared its throat in what sounded like a very official sort of way. Another frog answered from farther down the shore. Bear listened carefully. He could not quite tell whether frogs were having conversations or simply taking turns. Either way, it seemed polite. A mosquito landed on the back of Bear's paw. Bear looked at it. The mosquito looked, as far as Bear could tell, entirely determined. He gently waved it away. A moment later, it returned. Bear nodded respectfully. You are very committed. The mosquito seemed pleased to hear this. Bear admired commitment, just not always in mosquitoes. He tucked his paw beneath the edge of his scarf. The mosquito circled him once or twice, perhaps considering its evening plans before drifting off toward less complicated company. Bear wished it well. He took another sip of tea. The honey was especially noticeable tonight. He paused thoughtfully. I may have been a little generous. He took another sip, just to be certain. He was definitely a little generous. Bear considered this for a moment. There are worse things. He was rather fond of honey. It seemed unfair to blame honey for being so enthusiastic. The tea was warm. The night was calm. Across the lake, the little cabin lantern glowed softly through the trees. Bear liked that lantern. He had never met whoever lived over there. Perhaps nobody did. Perhaps the cabin simply enjoyed keeping a light in the window for anyone who happened to still be awake. Bear thought that was a very considerate thing for a cabin to do. A little ripple appeared near his fishing line. Bear leaned forward, then paused, then leaned forward a bit more. The little biscuit bobbed gently on the water. Good evening, Bear whispered toward the lake. I'm in no particular hurry. The ripple disappeared. Bear waited. Waiting, he thought, became much easier once you stopped expecting it to finish. He rested both paws on the fishing rod and watched the moonlight dance quietly across the lake. Some evenings asked you to do many things. This one only seemed interested in being noticed. Bear was happy to help. Then, after some time, footsteps appeared along the path behind him. Very fast footsteps. The sort of footsteps that seemed to believe they were late for something. Bear turned quietly toward the trees. The footsteps drew nearer, crunching over fallen pine needles, stepping around roots, pausing only long enough to become slightly tangled in what sounded very much like an uncooperative branch. "Oh," said a voice somewhere among the trees. "I do apologize." There was a brief rustling. The branch did not appear especially forgiving. A moment later, a fox emerged beneath the pines. He wore a tidy coat, buttoned all the way to the neck. In one paw, he carried 2 leather bags. 3 notebooks were tucked beneath his arm. He also appeared to be carrying something else. Bear looked carefully. It seemed to be stress, quite a lot of it. The fox hurried down toward the lake shore before finally noticing Bear sitting quietly on the moss. He stopped rather suddenly. "Oh." Bear lifted one paw. "Good evening." "Oh, yes, good evening. Lovely lake, very peaceful, wonderful atmosphere." He spoke the way some creatures flipped through pages, quickly, as though he worried silence might interrupt him. One of the notebooks began slipping from beneath his arm. The fox caught it with his elbow. One of the bags tipped sideways. He rescued it with his foot. For a brief moment, he looked less like a fox and more like a shelf that had become uncertain about its responsibilities. Bear waited patiently while everything settled down again. Then he scooted over a little. "There is room to sit." The fox looked at the empty patch of moss, then back along the path, then at the lake. "I really should keep going." Bear nodded. "I expect you probably should." The fox looked faintly surprised. "You aren't going to persuade me?" Bear thought about that. "I wasn't planning to." "Oh." The fox stood there for another few moments. The lake shimmered quietly. A breeze wandered through the reeds. Far away, an owl called out once into the darkness. Then everything became still again. Without quite deciding to, the fox set down one bag, then the other. He stacked the notebooks neatly on top. Finally, with a sigh so large it startled a nearby frog, he sat beside Bear. For a little while, neither of them spoke. The fox shifted slightly. Then again, he straightened one sleeve, adjusted his collar, moved one notebook a little closer. Then A little farther away, Bear watched the moon on the water. Eventually, the fox noticed he was the only thing still moving. Quite cautiously, he stopped. Another minute passed. His shoulders lowered, only a little, but enough to notice. It really is rather peaceful, he said at last. Bear nodded. It has had quite a lot of practice, he responded. The fox smiled. Not a large smile, just enough to surprise himself. He looked out across the lake. I don't think I've noticed a quiet evening in quite some time. They're easy to miss, said Bear. They don't usually announce themselves. The fox gave a thoughtful little After another moment, he noticed the fishing rod resting across Bear's lap. It leaned ever so slightly to one side. The wooden handle had become smooth with age. A small length of twine had been wrapped neatly around one of the guides where it had once been repaired. You've had that fishing rod for years. Yes. Have you ever thought about replacing it? Bear looked down at the old rod. I did. And I couldn't think of a very kind way to tell it. The fox blinked. He looked at the fishing rod, then back at Bear. I don't believe fishing rods have feelings. I don't believe they do either, Bear agreed. But I wasn't entirely certain. The fox considered this. It was not a conversation he had expected to have. Well, he said eventually, a newer rod would probably catch more fish. It might, said Bear. And a better reel. Perhaps. And stronger line. And more suitable bait. Bear glanced toward the little biscuit, floating patiently upon the water. I have wondered about that. The fox followed his gaze. Is that a biscuit? Bear nodded. It seemed friendly. The fox looked at the biscuit, then at Bear. I've never heard of anyone fishing with a biscuit. I've never heard a fish complain. The fox looked as though he might argue. Instead, to his surprise, he laughed. Only quietly, only once, but it was the first unplanned thing he had done all evening. The laughter faded, the quiet returned. This time, it felt much less unfamiliar. A small ripple appeared around the biscuit. Both of them watched. Nothing happened. I think, said Bear softly, the fish is still deciding. What about? Asked Fox. whether it's hungry. The fox nodded, as though this were perfectly reasonable. After another moment, he asked, "And if it isn't?" Bear took a thoughtful sip of tea. "Then I expect I'll have a biscuit." The fox rested his elbows upon his knees. For a little while, he watched Bear's biscuit drifting gently upon the moonlit water. Then he smiled to himself. "I still think," he said, "you could do rather well." Bear looked over. "With the fishing?" "Oh," said Bear, "if you organized it properly." Bear nodded thoughtfully. "I've heard organizing is very useful," he said. "It certainly can be." The fox picked up a small twig and absent-mindedly traced circles in the damp sand. "You'd begin modestly, of course. Just enough fish to sell at the village." Bear listened. "People would hear about you." "They would?" he asked. "Oh, yes. They'd tell their friends. They'd recommend you." "That sounds kind," responded Bear. The fox smiled. "It is." Encouraged, he continued. "And once demand increased, you'd need a larger operation." Bear looked around the quiet little lake shore. "There doesn't seem to be much room." The fox laughed softly. "You wouldn't stay here." "I wouldn't?" "No. You'd build proper docks." Bear imagined the little curve of shoreline filled with wooden piers. It seemed rather crowded. "And then?" "Storage buildings." "Oh, smokehouses." "I see. Offices." Bear looked quietly across the lake. "I hadn't realized fishing involved so much furniture." The fox laughed, a proper laugh this time. It drifted out across the water and disappeared among the reeds. "No," he said, wiping one eye. "It isn't really about the furniture." "No? It's about growth." Bear rolled the word gently around in his mind. "Growth. Exactly. More fish." "Yes." "More boats." "Yes." "More buildings." "Yes." "More paperwork." The fox hesitated. "Quite a lot more paperwork." Bear looked genuinely sympathetic. "I'm sorry to hear that." The fox laughed again. "I suppose I did rather walk into that." The lake shimmered quietly beside them. Bear took another sip of tea. The fox watched the steam curling into the cool night air. "And then?" Bear asked. "Well," the fox smiled, "years would pass. You'd become successful." "I see." "You'd have employees, managers, accountants." Bear wasn't entirely certain what accountants were. but they sounded busy. "And then?" he asked. The fox spread one paw toward the lake. "Then, after many years of hard work, you could retire." Bear nodded. "And then?" The fox smiled warmly. "You could spend your evenings sitting beside the water." Bear nodded again. "Drinking tea, watching the moon, fishing quietly, for pleasure." Bear was silent. He looked across the lake. The moon had climbed a little higher. The little cabin lantern still glowed through the trees. His old fishing rod rested comfortably across his lap. Beside him sat a fox who, only a little while ago, had seemed to be carrying the whole world in 2 bags and 3 notebooks. Bear looked back at him. "So," he said gently, "after all that work, you could finally spend evenings beside the lake?" "Exactly," said the fox. "With tea?" asked Bear. "Yes," said the fox. "And fish a little, for pleasure," the fox smiled. Bear thought about this for quite a long time. Long enough for a tiny ring to spread across the surface of the lake where an insect had landed. Long enough for a breeze to wander through the reeds. Long enough for both of them to forget they were in the middle of a conversation. Then Bear asked, very softly, "What do you think you're doing now?" The fox opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at the lake, at the moon, at the little bear, at the old fishing rod with its biscuit still floating patiently on the water. The answer had been sitting beside him all evening. Neither of them hurried to say anything else. The silence seemed perfectly comfortable. The lake certainly was. After a while, Bear unscrewed the thermos. "Tea?" he asked. The fox smiled. "If the offer still exists." Bear looked faintly puzzled. "I don't think it went anywhere." The fox accepted the little tin cup. It was warm against his paws. He took a careful sip. The tea was sweet, wonderfully sweet. "There is rather a lot of honey," he observed. Bear nodded happily. "I may have been a little generous." The fox took another sip. "I don't believe that's possible." Bear considered this with appropriate seriousness. "I was rather hoping you'd say that." For a little while, they drank their tea without speaking. A leaf drifted slowly across the moon's reflection. Neither of them felt any need to hurry it along. Finally, the fox looked down at the notebooks stacked neatly beside him. One was labeled Weekly Objectives. Another read Quarterly Plans. The third simply said Important Things. Bear noticed it. That one looks especially important. The fox looked at the cover. It seemed to, this morning. And now? Asked the little bear. The fox rested one paw gently on top of it. I think. He looked out across the water before smiling to himself. I think it can wait until tomorrow. Bear nodded. I expect tomorrow will still be there. I believe you're right, said the fox. Just then, the little biscuit disappeared beneath the water. Oh, said Bear. The fox looked toward the fishing line. I think you've caught one, he said. Bear picked up the rod, quite slowly. By the time he gently reeled the line back in, it had returned, completely empty. The biscuit was gone. Bear looked at the bear knot for a moment and smiled. Well, I hope whoever it was remembered to chew. The fox laughed quietly. He looked across the lake. I don't think I've spent an evening like this in years. Bear rested the old fishing rod across his shoulder. I expect the lake won't mind if you come back. The fox looked out over the water once more. I think I might. They gathered the cups, the thermos, the little tin that no longer contained any biscuits. Bear looked inside it anyway, just to be certain. It appears, he said, the fish and I have both run out. The fox smiled. I suppose that's fair. They began walking slowly along the forest path. Neither of them hurried. The moon slipped between the pine branches overhead. Their footsteps were softer now. When they reached the place where the path divided, the fox stopped. He looked as though he wanted to say something important. He thought about it for a while. Then he smiled. No, he shook his head gently. I think thank you will do. Bear nodded. I'm usually here on clear evenings. I rather hoped you might be, said the fox. The fox lifted his bags. They looked exactly the same as before. Bear noticed they no longer seemed to be carrying him. The fox gave one last wave, then disappeared quietly between the trees. Bear stood for another moment beside the path. The lake was still waiting, So he wandered back to his favorite place on the shore. He settled the old fishing rod across his knees, poured the last little cup of tea, still wonderfully honeyed. The cabin lantern across the lake continued glowing softly through the trees. Bear looked toward it. I think that's a very kind idea. He took one last sip. The moon climbed a little higher. The water whispered gently against the stones. Somewhere beneath the surface, a comfortably full fish drifted happily through the reeds. Bear was pleased to hear it. Fishing, after all, had turned out rather well, just not in the usual way. So if your thoughts have felt heavy lately, if the world has asked rather a lot of you, if you have spent the day becoming, improving, proving, or simply trying your very best, perhaps you may rest here too a while. The lake will keep watch. The moon is in no hurry, and Bear will always be happy to pour another cup of tea. The lantern across the water will stay glowing for anyone who happens to still be awake. Perhaps that's why Bear likes it so much. It's comforting to know that somewhere in the quiet, someone remembered to leave a light on. Sleep well, dear friend. The lantern will stay on a little longer.